and at summer always yeah.
Okay, great. Um, so we will wait 2 more minutes, then we will start because I just created the entire setup and everything. Um, I really like the topic that you are presenting. Probably the first episode on Oscar Wilde, and this is this will be our 21st episode in Victorian Vanguard series. We have two more members. Unfortunately, they will not join us today for some unavoidable circumstances. So I will be the host today.
Mhm.
I am Ritam Datto. So okay, let me start this formally. People will join, and after we will going to record this entire lecture, and after that we will upload that on our YouTube channel. So this will be there as an archive. And congratulations again, you are one of the selected uh, participant who's were selected who have been selected for publication to Peter Lang's next book. So
Thank you very much.
let me start this officially now. Good evening, everyone. I am Ritam Datto, and you all are watching Victorian Vanguard. This is our 21st episode, and today we have Adrian uh, Arana Armisto. I hope I am pronouncing it right. If I'm not, then
Fantastic.
please sorry about that. He is a pre-doctoral scholar at University of the Basque Country in Spain, and his topic is very interesting: transgressive aesthetics, hybridity, and identity in the picture of Dorian Gray. Over to you, sir. And now it's
Right.
yes.
Thank you. Let me see if I am able, first of all, to share my screen as I have delivered a brief presentation. All right. I hope that you can watch the presentation now. I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, yes, it's visible.
All right. Let me see if I can put this right. Fantastic. Well, first of all, here you can see the cover. I would like to sincerely thank you, the Victorian Vanguard team, for inviting me to participate in this insightful podcast series. It is truly an honor to have the opportunity to share my research regarding Victorian literature, and I hope, obviously, that you will enjoy it. So, um, there has been some change regarding the focus of my research. I am currently a member of the West Research Group that stands for Research in Western American Literature and Culture. And this is a well-established group of the University of the Basque Country. It is recognized by the Basque government, and it studies regional literary spaces under global effect, paying special attention to the American West. However, our group has several lines of research, and there are experts concerning various fields, from the American West to the study of the Basque diaspora, Chicana literature, and also studies regarding the Gothic genre, horror, and terror. This is why I started focusing on Oscar Wilde's work, and then I moved on and changed my scope, delving into other authors like Cormac McCarthy or Larry McMurtry. So during my presentation, I will examine Wilde's internal conflict regarding morality and aesthetics, focusing on the author's context and also on the Victorian context. So, regarding this methodology, as you may know, there have been two authors who have made two groundbreaking statements. One has been Friedrich Nietzsche, who around 200 years ago, basically, he proclaimed the death of God in the aphorism 125 of the Guy Science, the madman, and then later on delved into this theme of the death of God in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And this can be understood as a profound diagnosis of the waning authority of religious and moral absolutes in modernity, as this death signals the collapse of a metaphysical framework that once used to give coherence to truth, meaning, and value in Europe, of course. However, or as there are many similarities with Roland Barthes, this French author's proclamation of the death of the author in literary studies, as Roland Barthes in La Mort de l'auteur declared the death of God. And this way, what Barthes did was that basically dislodges the figure of the author as the sovereign origin of meaning in literary text. Hence, by emphasizing the role of the reader and language itself as sites of meaning making. This way, the author undermines traditional hierarchies of interpretation and authorship. And what both thinkers share this way is that they announce the end of transcendent sources of authority, whether divine in the case of Nietzsche or authorial in the case of Roland Barthes. So what these authors do is that they open the door to post-structuralist modes of reading, where meaning becomes decentered, plural, and unstable. However, I believe that it is a mistake to completely set aside the author, or at least not take into account his context, his intentionality whenever creating his work of art, as we might lose many important details. And life is just about that, details. So allow me to do, before the presentation, a brief digression by talking a bit about Tolkien in order to prove my point. As you may know, The Lord of the Rings is an essay on linguistic aesthetics about death and immortality, but we can only grasp this idea by knowing the context of the author. And as we will later see, in the case of Oscar Wilde, it happens exactly the same. For instance, whenever we understand that Tolkien was a philologist, one of the best that has ever existed, he was a man of extreme linguistic capacities. He could speak over or around 20 languages, and he created 5 languages himself. So The Lord of the Rings is created in order to somehow provide a new mythology or an unstated mythology for England. But apart from that, the author also creates all his diegetic universe, his secondary world, in order to be able to put into practice the 5 languages that he created. So language stops being just a vehicle and becomes the main objective. And as Tolkien himself argued, his work is about death and immortality, the notion of the inevitability of death. And we can understand this sort of concern that the author had regarding death whenever we know his context. For instance, the author at the age of 4 lost his father, Arthur, and at the age of 12 he became an orphan as his mother died, Mabel, at the age of 12. And in fact, he had he was so unlucky that he had to battle during the First World War in one of the bloodiest and harshest battle, which was the Battle of the Somme. So there he lost many friends and comrades, and this conflict somehow generated or influenced his work in a profound manner. For instance, we know that from his club, which was called the TCBS, the Tea Club and Barrovian Society, only Tolkien, the author, and Christopher Wiseman survived. The rest of the people died. And in fact, in the preface of The Lord of the Rings, the author claims that by 1918, he only had one intimate friend remaining alive. So we can see how this traumatic experience had a profound impact on Tolkien and on his worldview. And many scholars have delved into these themes, such as Eduardo Segura or Martin Simonson, for instance. And they have proved how the horror of the war influenced his thinking. And we can see this dichotomical view of the world, for instance, between home and the battlefield, between friends and enemies, light and darkness, the day and the night, and so on, that is represented in the work. And this dichotomy between immortality of the elves and the mortality of humans becomes one of the main concerns. So after this digression, my main point here is that in the case of Oscar Wilde, it happens radically the same. Whenever we are studying his work, it is essential to take into account, obviously, the Victorian context, his perception about aestheticism, and obviously his conflicting personality. And to delve into that, for instance, Robert Sherard, who was a friend of Oscar Wilde himself, wrote a biography about the author called The Story of an Unhappy Friendship. And this helps us to, to shed some light into Wilde's conflicting personality. So, for instance, the tension that we can see in the picture of Dorian Gray between the appearance and reality, the conflict between the social expectations and the personal freedom, remains at the core of this novel. And Wilde's own experiences with society's rule and punishment help him explore themes like identity, beauty, and morality in the novel. So, as I mentioned, his belief in aestheticism, in this transgressive aestheticism, remains essential. And we will now see where does it come from, as it shapes the story's focus completely on how outward appearances can hide deeper truths. And this is linked to the, obviously, to the Victorian context. So, to begin with, let's start by examining who Oscar Wilde was. As you may know, he was an Irish poet, dramatist, and aesthete. He is considered one of the foremost as well as most controversial authors of modern times, and his theatre plays, Lady Windermere's Fan and The Importance of Being Earnest, together with his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, are considered his chief artistic works. However, this novel, as you may know, was also a source of controversy, as the Marquess of Queensberry, who was the father of Lord Alfred Douglas, Wilde's lover at the time, used it to prove his accusations of unnatural practices in a trial against the author. It was one of the evidences that were used in order to condemn the author. This is why it is inevitable to draw a parallelism or to examine this work from the perspective of the author and take into account the context when it was written. So the author was born in Ireland. As you may know, he later on moved to study at Oxford. He was a high-class man, and there in Oxford he met Walter Pater, who was an Oxfordon. Pater became the mentor of Wilde, and Wilde started feeling a profound fascination for the artistic philosophy that Walter Pater proposed and employed, particularly in the Renaissance, one of his works. And we can see that Wilde himself uses many references of the Renaissance in his own work. So, for instance, a clear example that we can see in the novel is the aestheticism of Basil, the painter of the novel, as he basically represents this union between all the passion of the romantic spirit and all the perfection of the spirit that is Greek. And this is a quote of the picture of Dorian Gray. The passion of the romantic spirit represents John Ruskin's philosophy, and that perfection of the spirit that is Greek is Walter Pater's aestheticism. So Wilde, as an aesthete, believed that art and morality should remain separate, as they belong to different dimensions. The author, as an aesthete, as you know, was a strong defendant of art for art's sake, that it was founded, let's say, in France, and then it was spread around all Europe. And it was proposed by Theophilus Gautier, who was one of the founders of aestheticism in Europe. So Wilde superimposed art above morality, and he believed that the corruption of the body was worse than the corruption of the soul. In fact, in Wilde's conception of life, as he explains in The Decay of Lying, the soul and spirituality are themselves bounded to art. So the author got so immersed in the artistic philosophy and the power of beauty that, and this is one of my theses, I believe that he might have developed and suffered from cacophobia, which refers to an uncontrollable fear of ugliness. I don't know if you have already heard what Stendhal syndrome is, but it refers to a psychosomatic reaction towards beauty. So there are some people who have this special sensibility for art that whenever they have or they are exposed to too much beauty, they started feeling anxious and they feel the need to breathe, to stop. So Wilde basically felt the opposite. So, thanks to Robert Sherard, this friend and biographer that I have previously mentioned, we know that Wilde um, could not control his fear towards ugliness. So he started avoiding being in contact with those that appeared to him ill-favored. He started feeling a profound anxiety whenever he was surrounded by people that he considered to be ugly or ill-favored. So in this sense, I believe that Wilde suffered from this psychosomatic reaction from why or things that Dorian commits. Era. As you may know, it is this period where Britain, let's say, that ruled the world under the reign of Queen Victoria. But the most important part here is that this was a class-based society, and it was hypocritical in many different aspects. For instance, regarding sexual desire, as they defended this double standard, and they claimed that while men were naturally inclined towards sexual desire, women were lacking it completely. So, in these strict moral societies, there is this rebound effect or this opposite effect. And this is probably why prostitution and venereal diseases, for instance, were rampant in London. So, we know that many citizens, particularly those aristocrats from high and middle classes, led a double life. This is, they were or they showed to be respectable, but then in the shadows, let's say, they had many lovers and they went in search for new sensations. For instance, we know that Wilde himself was an opium So, what Oscar Wilde does is to criticize this hypocrisy that even himself put it in practice. So, in the case of Oscar Wilde, he was married to a woman, he had two children, but then whenever he was in private, let's say, we know that he had many lovers, and in this way, we can see how the Victorian society itself condemned this attitude through morality. So what they did was, in Freudian terminology, they hid their ego behind the mask of the superego and publicly condemned the id, although in practice, what they were actually doing was following the latter. And this is why Wilde probably criticizes this hypocrisy of the Victorian upper class in the picture of Dorian Gray, and also in the importance of being earnest with this game of masks, let's say. So this gives rise to many different contradictions that at the same time become or give rise to processes of hybridity, to third spaces that I will later explain on what they are. So before starting with the actual analysis, I believe that it is important to explain briefly the theoretical framework of dualisms and then to put it into practice, because these dualisms are the result of Oscar Wilde's tormented personality due to the severe morality of the Victorian era. So here you can see a definition of what dualisms are. The Blackwell Dictionary of Western Philosophy defines dualism as any metaphysical theory which, in contrast to monism, holds that reality is composed of two kinds of fundamental entities, neither of which can be reduced to the other. And in theology, this is bounded to morality, and it is used to differentiate two equal and opposite forces of the universe that stand in contrast, good and evil. And in fact, some theologists claim or stand a moral division of humans into absolute polarities. as they state that humans are either divine or evil creatures. So basically, two currents that defend this dichotomy or this contradiction regarding human nature are Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism. And the first, let me see, it has moved. Okay. So the first current, which is also called ethical dualism, stands that the divine creation of God tends to be morally good, while the Manichaeans state that the human tendency of people tends to be evil. In fact, Audi, regarding the Manichaeism, claims that the physical world itself is the result of the fall or entrapment of spirit in matter. And apart from that, in theology, this has also been used to differentiate the dualism of the limited power of humans in opposition to the illimited power of God. So the first dualism, or the people, or the first person who actually employed this term was Plato in the Phaedo, and there he used it to distinguish the ephemeral physical bodies in opposition to the eternal forms, which according to him were true substances that physical bodies failed to imitate. So we can see the distinction that the author makes between the sensible world, the world that we can feel through the senses, and the ideal world as two complementary parts that formed the universe. And this dualism was later on evolved thanks to Immanuel Kant, who in the Critique of the Pure Reason differences the phenomenal world, this is how we sense and perceive the world, in contrast to the noumenal world, this is how is the world by itself. So this distinction resembles the differentiation that Wilde makes of life and art. And this, let's say, distinction, he makes it in the decay of lying as two different parts of the same reality that imitate each other. So whenever we are studying art, the first thing that they teach us is that art has two functions. The first one is the mimesis. This is the faculty of imitating this primary world, and then the second property that it has is the poiesis, the faculty of creating a diegetic or a universe or a secondary world. And in this case, Wilde is against these definitions, as he claims that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. And this results from the fact that the self-conscious aim of life is to find expression, and that art offers it certain beautiful forms. So the last dualism that we will see and that we will later apply is in the philosophy of mind, which is the, let's say, last evolution, right? So this is the distinction between the mental and the physical, mind in opposition to brain, psycho as a more abstract concept, and neuro as a more scientific or material study. We have psychology in opposition to neurology, and this comes from the Cartesian dualism, which is the distinction between the mind and the body, as Descartes, the French philosopher, differenced between the extended substance, this is matter, and the thinking substance, mind. So in the 1980s, there was a radical rupture with dualisms thanks to the postcolonial thinker Homi Bhabha and his theory of the third spaces that I will apply into this analysis. This theory emerged in the 80s, resulting from postmodernism and posthumanism, and represented a rupture of binarisms that, as you may know, it aims to maintain hegemony. This is by dividing the world into two separate teams. We have the one and the other, and the one tries to constantly oppress the other through a vertical relationship of power. So third spaces, which are also called liminal or in-between spaces, aim precisely to end with these constituted binarisms in order to destabilize the relations between the one and the other. And in fact, Homi Bhabha, in the location of culture, claims that hybridization, which is what we will now see in the picture of Dorian Gray implies conceiving third spaces as a liminal space in between the designations of identity. And I state that the picture of Dorian Gray is by itself an example of a third space, and then I will later prove this. So, third spaces do not result merely from the blending of initial positions, but instead they become a completely new paradigm. And in fact, as Norma Cantu and Aida Hurtado explain, for Gloria Anzaldúa, who is the author of the Borderland theory, borderlands itself are third space generators that result from different societies and cultures. So now let's start with the actual analysis of the picture of Dorian Gray. The clearest example of dualism in this novel is the dualism stated by Plato between the body and the soul, which we can also understand as a Cartesian dualism between mind and matter. This is, in the beginning, we have this harmony between soul and body, as Basil explains. When he's painting the portrait of Dorian Gray, Basil claims that he can, as an artist, capture the equilibrium of the body and the soul in his portrait. And in fact, he claims, and I quote, he defines for me the lines of a fresh school, he's referring to Dorian, that is to have in it all the passion of the romantic spirit, as I've mentioned, this philosophy by John Ruskin, and all the perfection of the spirit that is Greek, the aestheticism of Walter Pater, the harmony of soul and body. So, in this sense, I believe that this quote resembles the dualism stated by Aristotle. Aristotle defended that the soul gave form to the body, and Wilde in Oxford, we know that he studied the Greek philosophers. So this Aristotelian conception of the soul giving form to the body, together with the aestheticism of Walter Pater and obviously the superficiality of the Victorian society, might have definitely influenced his irrational fear towards ugliness. This is the idea that someone who was ill-favored had to have a corrupted soul. So after Dorian realizes in the novel that he will lose his youthfulness while the portrait that Basil has painted will remain forever young, he claims how sad it is, I shall grow old and horrible, but this picture will remain always young. So he basically, through a mad wish, asks the divine to reverse this situation, and his prayers work in the end, in this Faustian way, as his mad wish comes true, and this is interpreted as a pact with the devil. So this is the first dualism that triggers the rest of the dualism, as we can see how his soul leaves his body and merges the painting, dividing Dorian's soul and body. And from that moment, we can see that the painting bears the burden of Dorian's soul, which is represented through a process of metonymy. When Mr. Harvard, who is a secondary character, loads Dorian Gray's portrait. And we can see this because Mr. Harvard mentions that it was a heavy portrait. He claims that it was something of a load to carry. And through this symbolic resource, we can see how Wilde exemplifies this burden that now bears the painting of Dorian's soul. And this way he plays with this dimensional ambiguity between the material in opposition to the spiritual. And we can understand this dualism in Manichaean or Zoroastrian terms, as we can see that the eternal youth of Dorian represents goodness in the novel, while the ugliness and corruption of the portrait represents this evilness. So the fact is that both his body and his soul are two complementary parts of the same entity. And through this Platonic or Cartesian dualism, what Wilde is actually doing is he's criticizing this theological dualism, this division of humans into good or evil beings, as Wilde was radically against this division that religious institutions did of humans into being either black or white regarding the morality. Wilde believed that we all humans are a blending of different proportions of goodness and evilness. This is, he viewed the world itself as different scales of gray. And this is so because we can see that these two opposite parts, which are this eternal youth and this corrupted evilness, are linked, or they are bounded through morality, as morality functions between the link, functions like the link between these two parts, and hence we can see that whenever Dorian sings, the ugliness and evilness produced come to the surface or the painting. This is the first dualism. Then we also have another dualism, which is the mental dualism in Basil. And again, we can understand this as a theological dualism. So Wilde based the physical appearance of the protagonist of his work, of the picture of Dorian Gray, and this is why his transgressive aestheticism is important, on friends and idols. And this dualism resembles the Cartesian dualism between mind and matter. And we can see that the author creates the three main characters of the novel, Basil, Dorian, and Lord Henry, by separating the body and mind of some of his intimates and combining them with his own conflicting natures, with his behaviors and concerns. So the first dualism that Basil has, or the first contradiction that Basil has, is a reflection of Wilde's inner conflict. This is morality, or the moral pathos, in contrast to art and aesthetics. This is why in the beginning of the novel, we can see that Basil doesn't care about the morality of Dorian. He only cares about the portrait that he is painting. Even though he knows that Lord Henry is corrupting Dorian, this is what he claims, and this is a quote. I have got the effect I wanted. I don't know what Henry has been saying to you, but he has certainly made you have the most wonderful expression. However, in the end, whenever he realizes that he has set art above morality, and that actually that's a huge mistake, he claims, I worship you too much, we are both punished, and he starts praying before being murdered by Dorian Gray himself. And if we analyze the physical dualism in the characters, we know, thanks to other scholars like Gillespie, that the politician Ronald Sutherland Gower was in the first edition, because as you may know, the picture of Dorian Gray had two different editions. In the first edition, Ronald Gower was the physical inspiration for Lord Henry, and in the second edition, he erased the straw-colored mustache and the Henry the Beard from this character in the novel. So I think that it is essential, and this is why I do believe that it is essential to take into account the context of the author whenever analyzing any artistic work. If we examine the similarities between this politician and Oscar Wilde himself, we can see that there were many similarities. For instance, Ronald Gower built a memorial for Shakespeare. We know that he was accused, like Oscar Wilde, of unnatural practices by, in this case, by the Prince of Wales, and he was fascinated by French feminist icons like Marie Antoinette or Joan of Arc. And aside from that, we know, thanks to his own diary, that he attended different nightclubs that Wilde himself might have attended. So, and this is just a hypothesis, of course. The similarities in the way of living of both artists, their similar personal tastes, economic status, and obvious spatiotemporal placement, I think that open the possibility for both artists to have met. And it might be the case that Ronald Gower, that this politician, influenced Oscar Wilde in the same way as Lord Henry influences Dorian. This is by emphasizing the importance of seeking pleasure above everything else, by somehow imposing this philosophy of new hedonism that Lord Henry advocates. So To conclude with this first part, we can see that Dorian himself is also the result of a different blending of people who Oscar Wilde met. And this is again another Cartesian dualism between the mind and the matter. We know that the physical inspiration for Dorian was Robert Serra, the biographer I just mentioned, Lord Alfred Douglas, Wilde's lover at the time, and the person that was somehow more related in this sense to Oscar Wilde, and then the poet John Gray. And it seems that the most relevant figure for the creation of Dorian Gray appears to be John Gray, from whom he borrowed obviously the surname. And thanks to the letters, we know that John Gray had even signed letters to Wilde as Dorian in this particular code. So the physical inspiration that appears to be most relevant is the poet John Gray. So, regarding the dualism in the main characters as a reflection of Wilde's personality, Gillespie notices that the tension among the probity of Basil Howard, the immorality of Lord Henry, and the unabashed self-indulgence of Dorian combine to echo the author's conflicting feelings during this period. So we can see that Wilde believed that there was a dualism in his own identity, because he had this conflict, as I have explained, that it is also represented in Basil, between sensual pleasure in opposition to the moral pathos. So in this case, I think that Basil represents this moral pathos. He's the character with the strongest morality. He actually cares for Dorian, and we can see that Dorian, together with Lord Henry, represent this philosophy of the sensual pleasure. So it might be the case that Wilde might have wanted to seek harmony between morality and pleasure. Although, as the plot develops, and as we can see, the internal conflicts of Oscar Wilde, and represented in Dorian, obviously, increase until the point where Dorian commits Basil's murder and finally ends by committing this suicide, destroying his own soul. So Wilde had this conflicting nature between morality linked to religion and the pleasure that he felt delving into new sensations, as the author himself explains in De Profundis, for instance. So, in Freudian terms, Wilde's nature conflicted between the superego and the id. So, besides representing his conflicting feelings, the author, through Basil, shows that the picture of Dorian Gray reveals Oscar Wilde's mind and soul. In fact, it seems that Wilde in the novel is screaming out loud the conflicting nature that he feels, as Basil claims in the beginning of the novel that every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. It is rather the painter who, on the colored canvas, reveals himself. I am afraid that they have shown in it the secret of my own soul. So I do believe that the colored canvas could be an analogy of the work himself, of the picture of Dorian Gray, and the painter as an art creator to himself, to Oscar Wilde. And if we examine this dualism in Freudian terms, as stated, this characterization represents Freud's tripartite division between the id, the ego, and the superego. Obviously, the id that refers to this part of the body or of the soul that operates in pursuit of pleasure. We can see that clearly Lord Henry personifies this part, as he's constantly saying to Dorian that it is essential to always be searching new sensations, and basically the importance of dopamine over serotonin. So in this case, we can see that Basil, on the other hand, represents the superego, as mentioned. He's the character with a strongest morality, and the superego can be understood as this moral censorship or this conscience. So Dorian remains the ego. This is, he remains the mediator between the id, Lord Henry's philosophy of new hedonism, and the morality that Basil tries to teach to Dorian. So Dorian is the result of both constraints of the psyche. And as stated, I believe that Basil share many similarities with Oscar Wilde, as I have mentioned. I think that he represents Wilde's persona in the novel. As if we examine the similarities, we can see that both are artists motivated by the infatuation with young men to produce their most accomplished works, and it is precisely after accomplishing their best works that these works lead both to their downfall. In the case of Oscar Wilde, as mentioned, he was well, the picture of Dorian Gray was used as an evidence to prove the accusations against him in a trial, and Basil is murdered because of the portrait that he paints. So this catharsis shares many similarities with Wilde's life, because he, as mentioned, decided to go to a trial against the Marquess for defamation after being convinced by his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. And if we examine the similarities between Lord Henry and Oscar Wilde, we can see that they both set aesthetics over ethics, particularly in art, but also in life, as explained through Robert Serrard's biography and by this possible psychosomatic syndrome that Wilde might have suffered. So this is a quote of Lord Henry. He claims that I admit that I think that it is better to be beautiful than to be good. And as we have seen, this was the thought or the way how Oscar Wilde think. How basically this was Oscar Wilde's feeling also, probably influenced by the superficiality of the Victorian era, and also because of this Aristotelian conception of the soul. And finally, regarding the similarities between Dorian and the author, we can see that Dorian himself is an analogy of this loss of balance between the id and the superego, and they both decide to go into the depths in search for a new sensation. And this is what Oscar Wilde writes then in the Profundis after being condemned. So apart from that, we also have this contradiction between the public and the private life, and this is obviously an analogy of Wilde's own life, but also of the rest of the aristocrat and high class people that lived in this Victorian era, as they behaved in a radical different way whenever they were in public or in private. They appeared to be respectable gentlemen, but then they followed their most animal impulses. I mean, we know that opium, for instance, was quite spread in England, and many had lovers. In fact, Wilde himself lived this double life, and whenever he was with his lovers, he claimed to be feasting with panthers. This is the term that Wilde uses. So Dorian himself does precisely this. He behaves as a respectable gentleman whenever he's in public with the rest of the aristocrats, but then whenever he's hidden, we can see that he becomes a bad influence for the rest, and even a murderer. So he is somehow corrupted. And this is represented whenever he is in the attic schoolroom, as he behaves in a radically different way, breaking with the superego and becoming the. So we can see that these behaviors are, even though they are separated, they are two complementary parts of Dorian's identity, And this way, what the author does is to criticize hypocrisy, that, as you may know, was an extended phenomenon among the middle and aristocratic classes. And similarly, regarding the setting, there is also a dualism in the, or this conflict in the setting of London. We have the West, where it is represented by the aestheticism of Walter Pater and Joris Karl Huysmans. It is a luxurious place with morally upstanding gentlemen, except, of course, in the private attic schoolroom where Dorian sings. And then we have the East as a corrupted place. There are the opium dens and, let's say, the suburbs. And I do believe this is another hypothesis that this could be an analogy of Great Britain and the United States. We know that Oscar Wilde lived some time in the United States, so he might be stating the fact that England was corrupted in opposition to the United States. But from an Eurocentric perspective, this could also imply a critique to the repression of the Victorian Empire. This is the idea that Victorian society behaved in a particular way whenever they were in the West from this Eurocentric perspective. This is in Europe, in England, but then in the East, in what we call the Orient, they behaved, as you may know, due to the colonizing and due to this military expansionism in a radical different way. So I think that this could be a critique of the repression of the Victorian Empire. And aside from that, there is also conflict, again, in the genre. For instance, the scholar Niels Clauson claims that there is this conflict between the self-development of, the self-development and the Gothic degeneration. This is why I have chosen this aesthetics for this presentation, combining Walter Pater's aesthetic philosophy and then this black color to represent this Gothic degeneration. And this conflict between morality and pleasure is by itself an analogy of Oscar Wilde's life. And as stated, there is this conflict in the genre as scholars cannot find this agreement point regarding or whenever stating the genre of the novel. For Julian Hawthorne, he first decided to claim that it was a novel of romance, and then he catalogued it as a parable. For Joyce Carol Oates, it is a hybrid between the Gothic and the Restoration comedy. For Shelton Waldrep, it is a realist novel, and for Kerry Powell, it is a magic picture fiction. So this disagreement basically proves my hypothesis that we could conceive the picture of Dorian Gray as a third space, as a hybrid between several different contradictory aspects, several absolute polarities that integrate, creating a radically new paradigm. And this is what I believe that the picture of Dorian Gray is. So, to conclude, I think that Wilde employs this polymorphous dualism and this transgressive aestheticism in order to criticize his socio-political context and the contradictions of the Victorian era. And as stated, we can see that Wilde himself was a man of inner conflicts and that this brought him misery. And we can interpret the picture of Dorian Gray as a reflection that mirrors the author's life. So Wilde employs different dualisms, as stated, such as the Cartesian, Platonic, or Aristotelian dualism in the main characters in order to try to seek harmony and to embellish his work. He uses different attributes, physical attributes of his friends and inmates, and also his own conflicting nature to try to seek harmony through this tripartite division of the three characters. And during this research, as I have explained, I discovered that Wilde felt panic and even hysteria towards ugliness, thanks to Robert Gerard's biography, and this is also represented in the novel. So one of my theses is that he might have suffered from cacophobia. So I consider the picture of Dorian Gray to be a proto-modernist work. Why? Because the author employs a clash between absolute polarities or antithetical elements in order to depict his own conflict at various levels. And sometimes these absolute polarities integrate, creating these processes of hybridity, as it is the case between the material self-development and the Gothic degeneration, for instance. So aside from this fact, we also need to take into account the elitism that this work displays, as we need to have read Walter Pater's The Renaissance to grasp many essence and details of the novel, such as the fragrances that appear or the odor of roses, for instance. So, therefore, I assert regarding these discrepancies of the genre that Wilde wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray employing proto-modernist features to criticize his sociopolitical context by showing through this polymorphous dualism the contradictions of the Victorian era. And finally, I contend that it could be interesting to analyze the dualisms of other literary works, together with obviously a comparative approach between the context and the author, in order to investigate these dichotomies and these conflicts that are inherent in different literary works. So I state that by studying the contradictions, this is the unconscious and unconscious motivations of the characters, their repressed desires, and the social and emotional relations between them, we can obviously, this combined with secondary sources of the author could shed some light on understanding different authors' conflicting personality. So here you can see the works cited section, and this has been all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, it was such a compact lecture. I mean, it is one of the wonderful lectures that we have ever in this show. And you touched almost everything from Nietzsche's Death of the God, from Barthes' Death of the Author, then you talked about art for art's sake and whatnot. You discussed almost every aspects of dualism. You beautifully described what aesthetic transgression is all about, and and you also touched upon few your own interpretations. For instance, like Basil is like kind of Oscar Wilde himself. I mean, this is a kind of interpretation that I never heard of in a while. So I really liked the lecture, to be honest, and I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions right now in their mind. I find it very similar to Christopher Marlowe's. Uh, that no, I forgot the name. Uh, Give me a second. Yes, when picture of in picture Dorian Gray, when Dorian Gray was selling, kind of selling his soul for that picture, it kind of reminds me of Christopher Marlowe. And I have few questions in my list right now because I've been taking notes, and it was a really good lecture, to be honest. Okay, so thank you again for this wonderful lecture. We will be taking questions from the audience, but first I have two questions right now. The first one is, I'm drawing from Oscar Wilde's polymorphic hybridity and identity in flux. So my question is, if identities are always changing, can anyone be ever responsible for who they are? Since it's always
Well,
changing.
that is quite a moral question. I do believe that identities are fluid. This is, they are constantly evolving, and our own context shapes our identity. But I don't think that we are, I mean, that notion of responsibility seems to be, for me at least, like morally, I don't know how to explain it, but yeah, I don't know, to have these moral connotations of what is to be good and to be evil, let's say, right? Resembling this like Victorian context. So I do believe that identity is always evolving, and people evolve along the things that happen to them in life. But I don't think that we are responsible for whom we are. Yeah, but this is just a personal opinion, of course.
Thank you so much for the reply. I mean, of course, this is the thing. Another question that I have, it's is very much situated to the geography, because in the
Yeah.
text we see that London has two sides. So the question is, if a city's layout reflects moral divisions, can changing the
Mm.
city change the people's morality?
Well, uh, obviously, yeah, I do think that. I mean, if we analyze the city, as I mentioned, we have this difference between the West and the East, but it is also a difference regarding the economic status. So we can see that the morality of the aristocrats um, is not shared, let's say, by the people who do not have their own resources. So if the setting, instead of being London, had been, I don't know, any city from the United States or any other European capital, I do believe that we would have a radically different story. We must somehow investigate the story, paying attention to the particular context. And in this context, London becomes essential, obviously, in the Victorian era. Yeah.
Exactly, that is true, and also the fact that it is kind of referred as a Gothic uh, work. However, it's very hybrid. Like you mentioned in the uh, previous section, like when you draw from Homike Bhabha's idea of hybridity, it is a very hybrid sort of a novel. It mixes aestheticism, Gothic, and literature, and so many things together. And I really like this aspect. Um, and Can you just elaborate more on that fact? Like, I really like the concept when you mentioned that Basil could be a self-reflection of Wilde himself. I mean, that is something that makes sense because Basil was eventually killed, or rather murdered, because of his creation. I mean,
His own
something.
work. Yeah.
Yeah, something
Yeah.
which makes.
I do believe that Basil represents Wilde's persona. First of all, because they are the two art creators, and as we have seen, Walter Pater's aestheticism was essential for um, for Oscar Wilde, to the point that he praised aesthetics over everything else, and this is why I do believe that he suffered from this reaction termed cacophobia. So if we, it is I don't know how to explain it. Curious the fact that Wilde seems to know in the novel that he will be condemned because of his own novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. There are so many similarities regarding The Picture of Dorian Gray and Dorian's portrait. The fact that it seems that Wilde is tired of this hypocritical society and he's screaming out loud, there are too many contradictions in this society, and I'm gonna prove it by explaining my own contradictions. So yeah, I believe that this novel is groundbreaking, and as you've mentioned, I think that one of the most important aspects of this novel is the concept of third spaces or hybridity. The fact that Wilde combines so many different aspects of different novels that no one had ever done this before, and this is what I believe that it is completely groundbreaking, and that represents actually a new paradigm as he manages to fight against these binarisms, against this division that particularly the Victorian society made between the one and the other in order to break with this vertical power relations. So I believe that, yeah, Wilde as an art creator was just on another level. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, we should focus on the liminal space that we see. We should read between the lines rather than just taking the binaries altogether. Since the book is very, I mean, it's a fiction. Or, however, can we call this a autobiographical fiction, if possible?
It is. I don't know. I don't know if I could delve into that. I mean, it definitely has many similarities with the own author. I mean, as I have explained during all my presentation, Basil, Dorian, and Lord Henry are themselves, um, if they are somehow blended together, they represent Oscar Wilde's conflicting personality. So definitely there's this autobiographical part in the novel. So yeah, maybe we could catalog this as an autobiographical fiction. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so I think now we should take questions from the audience. So if anyone have any question, you can write in the comment section or chat box, or also you can just unmute yourself and can ask question. Um, I really like this. I have this book right now in front of me, and um, there are a lot of things that I can ask. You know, you mentioned the death of the author of Barth. I recently read an article on New York's Time, I guess. So there's this author called I forgot the name, Stephen Marsh. He wrote this article, a book called Death of the Author. So he basically wrote a novel, uh, which was created by AI softwares. So he did not wrote a single word. He used ChatGPT or other AI softwares, and he wrote this novel. And then he was asking this question to the interviewer that who is the author now. So again, I mean, after AI, maybe this complexity
Yeah.
of authorship will become very difficult. Okay, so we have a question in the comment box. I guess let me check. Okay, so Umar Nizaruddin has asked this question: is the dualism Christomimetic?
I don't know the exact definition of Christomimetic, but if you mean that it has this theological component related to the Christian religion, as you may know, Wilde was himself a Catholic. I do believe that there's this component, as I've mentioned. The Victorian mentality is somehow shaped by the traditions of the Catholic, or well, and Protestant also, but yet of the Christian mentality, this division between the goodness of God and the evilness represented by Satan and the devil. And as we've mentioned, whenever Dorian, through this mad wish, separates his own soul from the body, it seems that he's doing this pact with the devil, as in the mythic legend of Faust, so of Goethe, for example, for instance. This has been reinterpreted, right? So I do believe that the religious thinking shapes the novel, definitely, and also his own thought and the Victorian context. Yeah. I don't know if I have answered your question. I have tried at least.
I guess you
Okay.
have done great. Okay, we have another question in the chat box. We have Manju, and the question is: excellent lecture. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. It's really informative. Okay, so it was not a question but rather an appreciation, because it was a very dense lecture. I really liked everything. You know, my notebook is filled with so many details, because this video will be there as an archive for anyone who will going to read Oscar Wilde in the future. And when you mentioned the fact that the painting is very heavy, I think Basil, no, not Basil, I think it was
Mr. Howard,
yeah.
yes.
So that kind of again, I mean, reminds me about the idea that we try to project something on a canvas, or maybe we try to project ourselves through so many different ways. Like on Instagram, we you ideally post the best photos, or like we try to maintain an image. And it
Yeah.
also reminds me of that part of Harry Potter, when in Harry Potter, I guess, there's this mirror called Mirror of Erised, where you see you can see the best version of yourself standing in front of you. So in the
Mm.
mirror, you will going to see the things that you want to be like. So this idea of
Mm.
uh, perfection, or something that you always wish to be, is there also. I mean, in the picture, he was kind of trying to capture the best version of himself. Is there?
Yeah. I mean, there are so many similarities between the Victorian context and this hypocrisy. If we put that context with the one that we're living now, for instance, as you mentioned, Instagram is a clear example of that. I mean, we somehow represent ourselves or try to show the world the best picture of ourselves, but it is all fiction. I mean, this is not who we are. Whenever we post a picture on Instagram, for instance, um, I don't know, in beautiful beaches and so on, what we're I mean, we're trying to show that we are living that life, but it is just a picture of a particular moment. So this hypocrisy of the Victorian era is still rooted in our society nowadays, and I think that technologies, in this sense, have contributed negatively to that. Yeah,
Exactly. We are still kind of in Victorian age in a way, not through this podcast,
definitely.
but through the ideologies that we are still following. So,
Yeah.
I don't. If anyone has any question, they can ask now. I really enjoyed this lecture so far, and I'm really thankful that you gave this beautiful presentation. Uh, so I don't think anyone will have any other question. Can you could you please share your mail if you want to? I mean, if someone has any other question, because the video will be there on YouTube for a long period of
Mhm.
time. If someone wants to contact you, they can do that through that mail. So
Obviously.
if it is possible for
Yeah.
you, then we can share that mail in the description of the video. So if in the future anyone tries to contact you, they can do so. Um,
For me, it will be a pleasure to somehow discuss any issue that someone has, and if I can be so if I can help somebody at least providing this grant of sand, of course I'd be delighted to do so. So yeah, we can. I will later tell you my email so that you can put it in the description. Sure, it will
okay.
be a pleasure.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining. So we are calling it a day,
Thank you.
and it was a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for joining the session. And we are happy to have you on the board.
The
So
pleasure is mine, and I'd be delighted to collaborate with you in the edited volume. So it will be an absolute pleasure, of course.
okay,
Yeah.
tata,
All right. See ya.
see ya.